Sounds good. Carry on.
And just to make sure, okay, so sharing the screen here. All right, so folks, tonight I'm going to talk to you guys about the Eccleston Mitigation Site. The Eccleston Mitigation Site is in the upper reaches of the Jones Falls. Jones Falls is a really special stream to me, and I think a lot of people on this call. It's basically the only trout stream that flows directly into Baltimore City. It's a beautiful scenic resource that you know, has seen its ups and downs over the years. It has a lot of history to it, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to be doing what we consider such a meaningful restoration on the Jones Falls. So before I get into what we're actually doing out there, I realize that a lot of you are new to stream restoration, new to the concept of what mitigation is. So I'm going to walk through those types of steps, and we'll go from there. So, like I said, I'll biography myself. I'll tell you who I work for. I'll tell you about mitigation and the mitigation process, and then I'll tell you about the Eccleston site history and what our plan is. And that includes the data collections that we did up there, which I will abbreviate because we have extensive data collection. I'll tell you about our stream restoration approach, which is a floodplain restoration, and then I'll take your questions. So I'm a professional engineer in all the local states here. I'm from Glen Rock, Pennsylvania, or as we used to call it back in the day, Exit 2 off of I-83. I graduated from Johns Hopkins University. Coincidentally, I used to commute to school and I used to drive by the Eccleston site all the time. It's right at the corner of Park Heights Avenue and Green Spring Valley Road. I have about 19 years of experience in restoration of stream, wetland, and coastal ecosystems. And I have really a lot of experience in cold water fisheries, both stock trout and wild trout in the Mid-Atlantic, New England, and the Midwest. I work for JMT. JMT was established in 1971. We're right in Hunt Valley. We're off of White Avenue, across from Valley View Farm and what used to be Noxell, but I guess is Johnson & Johnson, or one of them now. We're a full service engineering firm. We have landscape architects, highway designers, environmental people, you name it. JMT does it on one level or another. And we have over 80 water resources environmental specialists. And that number is probably a little dated. It's probably more than that at this point. And I honestly can't keep track of them all sometimes. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, what is mitigation? Why are you doing this at Eccleston? And what does it have to do with trout? Mitigation, it comes out of Section 4.4 of the Clean Water Act, where it talks about how wetlands and streams are jurisdictional waters, and it requires compensation for unavoidable impacts to those types of resources under 4.4. So for example, if you put a brand new bridge or a road in and it impacts a piece of stream, you're supposed to restore other stream elsewhere. And that's exactly what the Eccleston mitigation site is the mitigation for the electronic toll lanes on I-95 that runs up from 695 up towards Aberdeen up there. And, you know, a lot of people might think, well, that's kind of far away and it's a little bit different and not exactly the reason you think you would restore a stream, but we'll get to that and why it actually makes sense under the regulation. There's a regulation called the 2008 Final Mitigation Rule, and it talks about what the equivalency for those standards for mitigation are. And it talks about mitigation banking as the first priority, and then a thing called permittee responsible mitigation, which we'll get to, which is what this site is. There's also an executive order called the No Net Loss Executive Order. That's not the real name of it, but that's what we all call in the business. And it basically means if you impact an acre of wetland, then you need to restore an acre of wetlands, so we're not losing wetland resources. Wetlands are some of the most productive places on Earth. They're important for water quality. They're important for migrating birds. All different species use them at one period or another, and they're really important. So there's an executive order.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Truck's gone.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
And I can't hear. Okay, we're muted now. Sorry about that. So there's historically, this has been a very bipartisan issue, you know, this regulation. Nixon created the EPA, and the Bushes have reinforced the no-net loss, and Clinton and Obama have dipped their toe into these types of protections. So a lot of times, people will politicize wetland and stream work, and really, everybody has been in favor of it, and sportsmen have been in favor of it over the years. And I never try to look at things through a political lens because that changes every 15 minutes. But it's important to note that this is actually something that Americans have agreed on in the past, which is always refreshing. So I'll be saying a few definitions tonight. The site, for example, is a physical acreage restored, enhanced, or preserved. So the Eccleston site is that physical place. The sponsor is the entity who owns the mitigation. In this case, it's MDTA, Maryland Transportation Administration. And they're the folks in Maryland who have all the toll roads. So the Bay Bridge and the toll lanes, that's who has that. I'm going to talk about the interagency review team, and this is the team of regulators that give regulatory review and approval and oversight for all mitigation projects. It's a very complicated process to get that done. As you'll see, this is a multi-year effort. The service area. The service area is the geographic area where the impacts that we're mitigating for can be compensated for. I-95 happens to be in the Gunpowder-Patapsco watershed, and the Eccleston site is in the same watershed. If we were down near Washington, D.C., that wouldn't really work because that's in a different service area. There's a bunch of different nuances between service areas where they define things by not only the geographic area, but the geology, whether you're in the coastal plain or the Piedmont or the Blue Ridge. There's another thing that's worth mentioning, and the mitigation rule allows for a thing called the in lieu fee program. And that's where people, if they impact a resource, they just write a check to compensate for that. Maryland does not have an active in lieu fee program, but a lot of other jurisdictions do. And what happens with those in lieu fee funds is often the state will collect them and then use a nonprofit to administer them. So potentially, and I think they actually have other places, Trout Unlimited has actually used in lieu fee funds. I think Ducks Unlimited does this quite frequently. The Nature Conservancy does. And that's where you actually have that mitigation performed by a nonprofit who, actually really cares about that resource. So that's why I figured I'd mention that here. And then I'll mention as the last definition here, a permittee responsible mitigation. And that's where the mitigation is performed by the person actually permitted to do the impacts. And that's what the Eccleston mitigation site is. MDTA is the permittee. They have impacts for putting in those toll lanes, and they are the ultimate responsible party who I ultimately work for to conduct this mitigation project. Before I move on, I've said a lot of definitions. Does anybody have any questions about any of those definitions before I move on? Just shout them out. All right, hearing nothing, we'll move to the next slide. So what is the IRT, the Interagency Review Team in Maryland? They are the gauntlet of regulators that you need to get through to permit a project like this. And it includes the Army Corps of Engineers, the Environmental Protection Agency, Fish and Wildlife, Maryland Department of the Environment, Maryland Department of Planning, Maryland Historic Trust, Maryland Department of Natural Resources. We work a lot with Maryland Department of Natural Resources for these projects. They are ultimately responsible for the living creatures in these resources, and I want to make sure that I'm doing right by them when we do that work. The Maryland Board of Public Works, they weigh in on this. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Maryland Critical Area Commission, but only usually in the critical area, which is the 1,000 feet within the tidal interface in Maryland. And depending on the site, other relevant sub-agencies, county governments, nonprofits have been part of the IRT before. Other important stakeholders and parties have been part of that. And so this is a long process to work with all these agencies to get concurrence on what to do on a site and how to actually execute that compensatory mitigation. So with that in mind, we set out to do a project here at this Eccleston site. And it's located at the corner of Park Heights Avenue and Green Spring Valley Road in Garrison, Maryland, which is technically an Owings Mills address. And I first saw this site in 2008. I was doing a project downstream on another farm that Maryland State Highway Administration wanted to do. And I looked across the road and I said, hey, that's a really interesting place. I didn't see any dogs or no trespassing signs. So I went and I took a walk. And I realized there was a lot of real potential going on there, but a lot of things that had happened in the past on this site. And I always kept an eye on it. I noticed that agriculture was really impacting the stream. And I was there in summer, so I didn't see any trout reds, but I definitely saw, that there was potential habitat for them. And I knew that the water was cold in the Jones Falls. And I knew that this was a place that was worth looking at. So I continued to observe the site fairly frequently until about 2017 when I had an opportunity to look at that. So that's 9 years that I looked at this Eccleston site and wanted to see what was going on and did some research about it. So we got in touch with the owners and they were interested. We completed a title search. You'd think, why is a title search important when you go and do a mitigation project? The answer is because you put a perpetual easement on that property to help protect it in the future from development. And along with that goes a monitoring, maintenance, and stewardship fund, which is fairly substantial. So you want to make sure there's clean title on the project. We did a phase 1 environmental assessment, which basically means we look for any types of hazardous materials or hazardous uses that were once on the site. We look at all kinds of historic uses, and I'll go through, I have historic aerials I can walk you guys through on what they did here. We looked at the ownership. This parcel is owned by the Eccleston Land Company, which is owned by a consortium of family relatives and blind trusts. And it's a very complicated ownership. We look for utilities. We look at old maps. We look at letters that we send to coordinate with the agencies. And in part of that process, DNR came back and said, hey, we have some historic data for this site, and we'll talk about what that means as we move forward here. As part of the process, we walk the site multiple times with that agency review team, and some of you guys from Trout Unlimited were part of at least one of those walks. I have honestly walked the site so many times with regulators and different stakeholders, I cannot remember who all has seen this site or not. We did detailed negotiations with DNR Fisheries and the rest of the IRT about the best way to restore this trout stream. This is not a type of thing that you do in a vacuum. You have to justify why you want to work here, and I'll talk about what the reasons for that were. So as part of our research, we were able to look at and examine features in the stream, and we realized that the entire site had been drained for agriculture. The streams had been straightened and ditched, and there's clay tile pipe underneath most of the fields and the bottom floodplain area. The stream is piped in a few places. The actual Jones Falls is diverted for about, I believe it's about 2,000 feet in the middle section of our site. And about, between 20 to 60% of it, depending on the flow of the stream, goes into that pipe at different parts of the year, which is a real impact. Obviously you want to keep your base flow in the stream and not in the pipe. There were at least 3 potential dams on the site, and one of them was still intact. And then there was really a lot of invasive species on the site. So invasive species are species that are not traditionally part of this ecosystem, and they included on the site Phragmites, which is that real tall grass you often see down at like Ocean City at the inlet. There's European privet. Privet was used for hedges. I cannot count how many invasive species were on the site. We looked at the historic data and we realized in the 1980s that there was really a thriving brown trout cold water fishery that really had very few other warm water species. And as we looked at that data and the future data points that came after the 1980s, we saw that it was becoming, just by looking at the types of fish that were in the stream, it was becoming more of a warm water fishery, even though there really wasn't a lot of development in the watershed. And ultimately, not really a lot of change on the site. No one was cutting down the trees. People were farming it as they had been. We realized that there was this waterworks structure, which consisted of pumps and an overshot water wheel and a drainage system that was really impacting the site in terms of, how water interacted with the stream and how groundwater and surface water interchanged. We found various easements, power line easements. There's a defunct easement for the waterworks I just talked about that was used as part of a dairy operation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get here. There's a quarry on the site that had been turned into a garbage dump. So we have this site, it has these resources in it, but it has all these different historic impacts working with it. And I'll show you, we'll just go right to the unlabeled map. This is a 1927 aerial photo of the actual site. Can you guys see my arrow cursor? Tom, maybe nod up and down if you can see it. The pointer. Anybody see it? I don't know if I can do a pointer. All right, hold on. How about now?
Yes. Yeah. We can see
Okay.
it.
All right. So for those of you familiar, this area right here is a very stately English stone farmhouse owned by Bosley Wright. It's right here on, this is a Green Spring Valley Road that moves through here. This
Okay.
is an excavated quarry, and this is the Jones Falls. And what's really incredible about this is you'll think, well, Jim, this is a trout stream. Where the heck are all the trees? And the answer is in 1927, there basically were no trees on this site. Let me switch to the next slide here. So this is the annotated version of this. Here you can actually, we actually were able to point out where the dam was installed, one of them on the site. Here's the quarry, Bosley's house. We found all these pipes and structures. There's all these scars that you see through here. These are drainage ditches and different drainage features. Old houses that aren't here anymore. This is Park Heights Avenue here. So we were able to find a lot of common points, but we understood that there was really a lot of different historic impacts going on here. So then we go to the 1953 aerial slide. And you'll notice with this, it's a little bit better quality because, in 1927, photographs, hadn't advanced as much as 1953. And you'll notice there is still a profound lack of trees on this site. This area where you can see my cursor here right now is fully forested, and we consider a preservation and trout spawning area. It has 0 trees basically on, except for a few here. You can see various fence lines. This was an active dairy at the time. And basically very little tree growth, which we thought was very interesting because we're like, well, this is a trout fishery. Are the trout a recent arrival here? Or was there just a lot of cold groundwater keeping this cool enough for them? And I don't have an answer to that. We don't have fisheries data that goes back that far. And here I've annotated it again. Here's the dam that I talked about before, and here's the quarry. Here's Bosley's house. Bosley's house now has trees all the way around it. There's an outfall to a pipe. So you have the dam here. The water is for the Jones Falls is diverted through here to the waterworks and then out the outfall. And what this system did, and I'll get to here shortly, is it provided high pressure cooling water for a dairy that was at the top of the hill. So when we talk about historic impacts, we see this a lot on project sites. People ditch and realign streams and drain land for agriculture, and this was no exception. The stream, when it meanders, is difficult to deal with, if you're doing agriculture, be it pasturing or actual tilling. So they straighten things, and then they install clay tile. And these are just some historic pictures along with a present day picture that actually shows tile down here still in the Jones Falls. And we estimate conservatively that there was over 25,000 feet of clay tile on this site, which we are removing. And there's probably more than that. And that's about 5 miles of clay tile. Tiling is done, so you have these surface water impoundments, and you're going to drain that soil and exit that water into a ditch. That's, basically what tiling and ditching does. And this is a whole science. There's whole different patterns of tiling, herringbone and parallel. And what we have at the Eccleston site is a double main system of tiling. You have a floodplain, which is partly untiled, and it has perpendicular drain tiles coming into it. And this picture over here shows all the different types of clay tile, And you can actually identify the clay tile based on its shape because of who manufactured it. There was very limited manufacturing in the United States at the time. And based on that, I estimate that the clay tiling that we found at Eccleston first started to go in probably in the 1830s. And then they finally wrapped this up, and the latest tile is more modern, terracotta with a coating on the outside, and was around maybe 1915, 1920. And that corresponds with the information that we found about the waterworks on the site. So, a little bit of information there. We found that for 200 years, someone has been ditching and draining this. And that doesn't count tile that we might not find. It would be very common to use piles of brush and sawmill slats and things like that that are harder to find for drainage. And those are all effective drainage strategies that I've found. We found 400-year-old boards and stacks of brush that we've carbon dated that's still functioning and draining wetlands. So the other thing that's interesting in this valley is there's also a lot of damming. There was a potable water supply dam that was downstream. And when you combine damming with ditching and tiling and poor land use overall, you get a thing called legacy sediment. And that's sediment that accumulated washing off the ground surface of the upland areas and accumulated in the floodplain valley. And that's what you can see here in this photo. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the restoration approach. But basically, if you look in this layering here, this top material is water that washed off the hill slopes. This blacker material is a wetland layer, and below that there's a native gravel layer. And people would have put that tile right down in that gravel layer, and it just drained beautifully when you did that, and you got a big farmable area. Of course, when you're doing agriculture right up to the bank, and this is the Eccleston site, photos of it, there's a lot of erosion impact. And, all of us know that, that's not really great for trout. It's not just the erosion of the sediment, it's the physical chemicals that are sprayed from modern agriculture as part of no-till agriculture. This would be sprayed with Roundup, which is glyphosate, and also atrazine at least twice a year. As well as all the chemical fertilizers and things like that. When you have a tile system directly under agriculture like that, you're providing a direct conduit for those chemicals to enter the stream. So that's not a good thing. That's really detrimental if you're a bug or a fish in the stream. So again, these are more examples from our site. Outfalls, sediment, pipe draining, and we found this prevalent throughout the entire site. There is no place that we are working on this site where we do not have some type of drainage system like this. This is another example out there. This was an inlet pipe that went to a drain and a trough that was probably used for agricultural watering. This is about I believe it's about an 8-inch diameter clay pipe. And it completely dries out, as you can see in the right side photo, a portion of the Jones Falls with zero flow. And the first thing I did when I was out here and saw this is I hunted up a trusty volleyball that someone had gone and discarded and washed down the stream, and I jammed it in that pipe, and the Jones Falls flowed again. Because I wanted to see what would actually live in the Jones Falls. I knew not a lot will live there if it only gets storm flows and it doesn't have base flow. So we had that to deal with. And here's another example and just a closer showing of it diverting that stream into a pipe, and this stayed open. This is the actual video of it where you can actually see. And again, I'm not sure how my bandwidth is working with this for you guys to be able to see it, but this is diverting another diversion that we found that's diverting a fair amount of water on the site. And a lot of these went into these diversion boxes that overflowed, and these were agricultural watering areas for cattle and whatever other livestock they might have had. And because this was a dairy farm, there was a few of these on the site. And we've since tried to track these down, but of course there's no drawings that actually show any of that. So it's all by investigation the hard way, looking around and encountering things with an excavator and then dealing with them. And you can see this flowed steady. This actually diverted most of that fork of the north branch of Jones Falls there. And I apologize for the video quality. It's not not the best on Zoom, but you guys get an idea. There were actually fish inside this, so it was actually diverting organisms with the stream as well. So we know there was this waterworks on the property, and it was used to produce what was called clean milk at Burnside Farms. And this had to do with various scares about tuberculosis back in the teens and 20s. So in 1915, they put this waterworks in, and it pumped high pressure water, cold water, all the way up to the hill on the top of Burnside up there. And they used it to, they used it in the house. It was potable water. They did all kinds of things with this to keep the dairy clean and to keep milk cool. And they abandoned that practice in the 1940s due to the widespread adoption of pasteurization of milk. So before that, you would have had raw milk and were distributing it. And they thought this process kept it clean. It probably did not do that, but you know, pasteurization is a good thing. And that's what they did. So we actually got some Maryland Historic Trust information about this. And the long story short on this was it was used to keep stable ceilings, walls, and floors thoroughly washed and scrubbed. And it took huge amounts of water. And that water would have been discharged back down the Jones Falls into that tributary from the farm. And it would have had cow manure in it and everything else from the dairy. So this was not a great thing for water quality downstream. And also ironic, you know, because there was potable water supplies downstream. And it went through two 10-foot water-driven overshot wheels with a 3-inch pipeline. And the pumps were these gigantic, as tall as a man, 3 piston pumps, which we actually ended up removing. And beneath there were 300-foot deep wells that pumped groundwater. And it pumped over 100 gallons a minute. So this is a major operation, and to conduct that and use the use of hydropower to do that was no small feat in 1915. So this was a really significant impact to the Jones Falls, and one that they just abandoned. And you know, the impacts of that have lingered to the present day. This is the outfall of that. This diverts in the summer. It'll divert nearly the entire Jones Falls and dry it out with only a trickle and major storm flows. And you can see that this pipeline was really significant. This is about a 24-inch pipeline. And it was still in pretty good shape. It was still diverting the Jones Falls. So really a lot going on in the site. It took a lot of in-depth investigation. Like I said, this waterworks dated to the 1920s. There's about 40 feet of concrete weir and dam that diverts that. It diverts basically the whole stream in different parts of the year. The dam is it's an impediment to trout movement, and it's not so much the height of the dam as the height of the debris that it accumulates above and below the dam, and it was causing a fish blockage issue. So we're removing the dam. We've already done that and restoring the historic water flow. This is that dam, and you can see it's just a hydraulic jump, and it was sort of camouflaged in here. There's this concrete weir that comes through here, and then these head walls that stretch approximately 40 to 60 feet upstream from each one. So really a very significant feature. And you know, everybody loves old concrete. Concrete, when it stays wet, gets stronger with age. So this has been, you know, that was a very challenging thing to work on. And you can see in this video here, just the amount of water that's moving over. That's a very small portion of the Jones Falls you see cascading, because a lot of it is actually being diverted in this vault that you see in the corner over here. There's an inlet underneath there. And then it goes into that 24-inch pipeline. Needless to say, most regulators and even locals were completely unaware of the extent of what we found on this site in terms of, you know, just the actual historic impact out here. And as if that was not enough, there was evidence of another dam that was here, including what could be a corduroy road, or possibly it was a flume for mining or sifting material or a mill race. We have not figured out what this other historic dam was, but this occurs further upstream from where we're restoring in a fully forested forested area that really is decent enough that, there's trout utilization, things up there that we didn't want to really mess with it. And it was very common to see minor dams like this through the mid-Atlantic through the colonial period. And this was just another one. So, we have evidence of, 2 existing dams, evidence of a third, and then a 4th larger dam downstream that all impacted the site. And this site is about 100 acres. To give you an idea of this vast network of damming and diversion through the whole site. We found evidence of a corduroy road. That's where people would use logs or half logs to go over a marshy area. We found that perfectly preserved in moist soil and in groundwater. We found a flume, and I'll sort of try to show you this in the next slide, or possibly a flume, or maybe it was a mill race. And the restoration does not remove that dam. So here are the head walls. Let me move my cursor over. These stone piles here are stacked and mortared stone. This probably dates to potentially, I'm sure they repaired it, but potentially the late colonial period, maybe 1800 or so. And then if you look in the photo here, there's these slats and these weird perpendicular lines across this piece of stream. And what these are is these are hand-hewed log sills, some of them with nails sticking out of them, and planks nailed to the side, still preserved in the sides of the bank. And guys, I've been doing this a long time. I still don't know what this structure was. The best I can think is it was a flume or a mill race or something like that. But somebody went to a lot of effort to construct that. And then they later abandoned it. And, and then this beautiful forest grows up and things naturalize. But it just goes to show the history and the potential impacts that are beneath the surface in some of these areas. And these are all things that we had to figure out and resolve to do work on this site. And this is just a video showing of what that looks like. This is a very cold and nice part of the Jones Falls. It's very scenic. This is in fall. This is right when we were doing red counts, or just about right before. And trout do utilize and spawn in that area despite that historic impact. So for us, we had to sort out what areas had historic impacts that were impeding the biological use of the Jones Falls. And right there is a place where trout have spawned, right below this dam. And I might actually be trying to zoom in to try to show a red, but you know how cameras are. But we had to try to sort out what areas had this historic impact, where was the biology working correctly despite that impact, and then where were places that we had to go and do things more drastically to clean things up and to make things function better, and to weigh those impacts, both positive and negative, that we do. To top this off, we have a historic quarry on the site, which became the entire neighborhood's garbage dump. It was filled with tires and oil tank. And for some reason, they decided that they needed to throw, and I'm not exaggerating this, about 20 wringer washer machines into this quarry. And guys, I'm just going to tell you, we scrapped a lot of wringer washers and parts of cars and things like that. And according to the construction group, they thought that this was pretty good beer money for them. But they've also pulled out something around 500 tires and counting. So multiple dumpsters of tires and things like that. Ironically, we tested this. We did what's called, constituent testing, where we look for contaminated material in this, because we didn't want to have a hazmat situation on our hands and suddenly unleash that into the Jones Falls or anything by accident. And when we tested this, we found a slight elevation of some compounds that are associated with plastics. So probably the tires and the rubber. But other than that, it was pretty clean. There was really no concern in there. So one of the requirements of the landowner, and also the requirements of just being a good steward on a site, is we're cleaning this whole quarry out and pulling all the tires and debris as much as we can find out of there. But obviously, we don't want to turn the thing upside down and potentially find a problem that is not manifesting itself right now, or something that is naturally attenuated. So we're being very careful about that and monitoring that. So with all that historic information in mind, then we get to the actual data collection for the project. So one thing we did is we collected about 40 years of historic fishery data from DNR, and we were really beneficial to work with Mark Staley and John Mulliken and Greg Golden at DNR. They've been so helpful and so skeptical of me coming to them, and rightfully so. When somebody says, you know, when you have this historic data that you're interested in a restoration in a place where they've actually harvested trout for the use of their genetics, you know, in other places in stocking, you know, that gets their attention. And, you know, that was something that they needed to see the data, and I needed to show it to them to justify what we wanted to do there. We've done 5 years and still counting of red counts. So actually looking for trout spawning. We do this every year. I'm going to tell you right now, I don't know if some of you guys have done that before. It's a beautiful day in November to go out in the field to go and do a red count. We have 15-minute thermal data in 5 locations. And this is really important because I know you guys collect some of your own thermal data. We do very rapid thermal data collection. So 15 minutes is 4 times an hour. And what that tells you is far different from what daily or twice daily or even hourly data will tell you, because you can actually capture the thermal impact of storm discharges and how quickly it recovers. And then if you use regional data for air temperature, you can see when the stream is warmer than the air temperature or colder than the air temperature, which tells you a lot. And we'll get to that, but that was a really important thing for us to do to understand what was going on out there. If you average that data, the Eccleston site looks like a beautiful, constantly cool trout stream. But where the real information came out is where you looked at the daily range, and we found that we had about a 25 to 30 degree temperature shift some days in the summer, which told us that our system was very disconnected from the groundwater table. That was a huge surprise to all of us. I'll talk a little bit more about that soon. We did what's called a benthic survey. That's where we actually look at the bugs in the stream and what's living there. And we did a new fishery survey. And this data was done because I knew I had historic data. It was done by a totally independent entity. It was done by Martha McCauley at EA Engineering, also in Hunt Valley on the other side of the circle. I did used to work with Martha. She's a great scientist. She's Maryland Biological Stream Survey certified. And she has, you know, there's nothing more important to her than data integrity. So we had third-party fishery survey done. And instead of just surveying the reaches near Park Heights, they're easily accessible. We assessed the whole 6,000-foot site to make sure we got an adequate picture of not only the tributaries, but the main stem of the Jones Falls and how they differed, because we had also corresponding thermal data to go along with that. We did a full wetland delineation, figuring out what areas were wetland and not. Also what we call a function and value assessment, actually assessing the quality of those wetlands. And then we did a very similar forest investigation where we looked at the forest stands that were on the site, what their value was, their health and condition. And that was all through the state process using those established methodologies. Because I could literally talk for probably 4 or 5 hours straight, as I have done with DNR, and I have not bought you all dinner tonight to enable that. We can save that for another time. I will give you the highlights of the data collection. The fisheries data was really interesting because the data that DNR gave us showed sort of that there was a push towards more tolerant and warm water species in the reach, but it wasn't conclusive. And when we looked at this, basically, you know, me and the other biologists were like, well, you can't just go by that. You need other indicators and more information. Fair enough. So we collected that data. But what we found when we collected our own data is that in a system where you might have found 6,000 trout in a 200-foot reach or something similar to that, or maybe a 400-foot reach, I forget exactly what the DNR reach was, we found fewer trout in the entire reach, the 6,000 feet, than DNR did in their one location that they sampled, which was disappointing. And that was in 2019, I believe we did our survey there. And what we found is there were a lot of warm water species that were encroaching in. So where we didn't have any hybrid sunfish, where we didn't have as many black-nosed dace and things like that, we found those species more commonly, and we even found a largemouth bass in the stream. So that's not a great sign for maintaining a cold water fishery. And what we found is that the cold water fishery since the 1980s had moved into being a mix of warm and cold water species. We did not observe trout reproduction in any of the locations where flow had been diverted. Now realize when I say that now, given the rest of the presentation, you're probably thinking, well, of course you didn't, Jim. It took 5 years to come to this conclusion. And we also did a controlled experiment with that because this fall, we actually removed the dam and the diversions and put the full flow of the Jones Falls into where it was previously diverted from and observed to see whether trout would reproduce. And this was in early or late September, we did that. So it could naturalize and, by end of October, early November, the fish wouldn't know any different. And what we found is they still didn't reproduce in the middle. And that has to do a lot with the substrate that we observed there versus in other places. And I can talk more about that. That's a very complex thing to discuss in an evening presentation. We found that the tributaries to the Jones Falls are mostly too warm to support trout in the summer. So you would find a couple trout in some of these small tributaries. They would be hiding in the bottom of maybe the deepest pool. But the main stem had a very large thermal range during the day, between 15 and 20 degrees often, but we occasionally saw up to 30 degrees. And what that told us was, as even though the system was forested, and we'll get to more about the forest actually out there in a little bit, you were still getting enough thermal gain during the day and not enough groundwater interaction that this stream would gradually heat up as the water flowed through the site and exited the site, despite it being, most of the time a very cool trout stream. And what's really interesting is in the winter, when you would have temperatures, much lower than 55 or so, the actual ground temperature, you would see that the thermal range swung the other way and the stream was actually much colder than the ground, showing that it was more influenced by the air temperature and not necessarily recharge and interaction with the groundwater table. So that was a really a big deal to us, and I'll get into how we design to get around that and to remedy that. The other thing that was a big surprise is the benthos, the bugs in the stream, is poor in all locations, and that just knocked my socks off because, 8 years before this, I was flipping over rocks and finding mayflies and stoneflies and damselflies and all these really good high quality indicators in terms of bugs. And they weren't there when we surveyed the site. So we knew that something, was happening at this site, and we had seen previous evidence and things that concerned us. But this really hammered home that there were some really challenging things going on in this site. So additional highlights, using that controlled study where we removed the dam and let the stream flow through, the only real logical conclusion as to why trout don't reproduce in the center part of the site where the historic diversion was, and looking at all the survey of the actual gravel in the stream, we actually sieve and count and measure gravel to determine the size of it. We determined that the substrate is really too large and embedded for trout reproduction in the center part of the site, probably because historically this had been ditched. And when you ditch and confine a stream, it's gonna, the storm flows that come through, those floods are gonna scour out the smallest particles first, and they leave the largest ones behind, and trout simply can't utilize them. And not just trout, you have a whole supporting fishery for those species, and they need certain smaller sizes of gravel to work with. The existing dam we were able to determine was probably a young of year blockage, and that would be only in times when debris was blocking it. The fisheries guys have told me that young of year trout are often called popcorn because they can just leap wherever they want to go. But 3 feet is a long way for a trout to leap and actually, direct itself where to go. We also noticed that there is a deficiency in woody cover as well as overhead cover in the reaches that we wanted to restore. There were no real areas for young fish to have a place to rear and grow. There weren't a lot of refugia, and there are very few overwintering habitats for trout. So if you're a brown trout living through the winter, you need a pool that stays thawed, and that needs to have a certain amount of depth when you're not as groundwater connected and your temperature is swinging down low, and possibly, freezing the stream. So we didn't find a lot of those really deep pools. And, these conclusions, it's very easy to say that these are quick conclusions. Conclusions like this, some of these required us to physically go and measure the actual quantity of overhead cover and map it out, and actually determine how many square feet of overhead cover per 100 feet of stream were actually present. Compare that to other trout references that we know are functioning well. So each of these data collection highlights I've given you has a really large supporting study and many field books of Jim's chicken scratch, noting things and photos and everything else to go along with it. And it took, like I said, for us to start constructing. We started construction in August of 2021. There's about 4 years of in-depth study, and then there was about 8 years of observation before that. So we take this seriously. So I've described all these issues with the reach, and that leads us to, well, Jim, how do you go about restoring a stream like this? And the technique we chose is called floodplain restoration, but it's not quite as simple as that. There's also a lot of things we did specifically to create habitat. But floodplain restoration is the restoration of a stable stream and wetland and riparian complex on a native geologic base. And that native geologic base is a gravel layer that we observe in the Piedmont and a lot of other places all over the world. And it's basically what's called a matrix supported quartz gravel. And the best way to think about a matrix supported quartz gravel is the pieces of gravel are not touching each other. They're supported by a binder, a soil, if you will. And the greatest analogy to this is chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream. So tonight, when you guys are raiding the fridge around 11:30, 12 o'clock, and you're cracking open the Ben and Jerry's there, you're going to notice that those little balls of cookie dough are supported by that creamy, delicious ice cream, and the same with chocolate chips. And that's the same way to think about what a matrix supported gravel is. And we only do this where the geology is there to support that. So this is the Eccleston site. And what we see when we look at this, let me move my cursor over, we see the quote unquote top of the floodplain here. We see 400 years roughly of sediment that is accumulated from poor land use and damming of the stream. And this is a non-hydric or non-wetland soil on top. You can see it has a brighter color. And it typically has pretty low organic content in it. And then right below it, you see this gray to black material. And it's got little white specks in it. Those are quartz gravel that's been churned up by critters over the years. And down at that interface is where the true floodplain, about 10,500 years ago, of organic matter and gravel below that is stored. And that was a wetland layer. And we see this prevalent across the entire Eccleston site. You also see this. I did a project in Guam, and though it has different origins, you see the same similarity, a buried wetland layer. There was a dam downstream of this. You see these piles of gravel on top. This is fluvially deposited gravel. The pieces of gravel are touching each other. This is something you see all over the world. I saw it in Iceland, Scotland, other parts of the UK. It's all over the place. I've seen it all through the Midwest. It's in Canada. Europe is really special because you'll have, eons of damming, basically, millennia rather, of damming, dams on top of dams, new wetlands created, then covered by another dam. People have been messing with waterways for a long time. That's the best way to look at that. And, why is that soil deposited on top of that wetland when you put in a dam? And it comes down to the poor land use practices that were common with agriculture. And Eccleston site is no different. This is work from Walters and Merritt, or Walter and Merritt's at Franklin Marshall College over in Lancaster. And here they've actually plotted dams and depths of sediment relative to those dams and the density of water-powered mills. And as you can see in some of these figures, this was a very prevalent thing. And it was the same at the Eccleston site. We had various dams for the waterworks for the dairy. We had a potable water supply downstream, and maybe a grist mill thrown in there somewhere at some time as well. So what do we see when we see these impaired areas? It's what we see at Eccleston. We have a stream that may be perched above that historic base level where the wetland used to be, below or at the base level. You see hydric soil that, if you carbon date it, goes back about 11,000 years. And then it ends about 200, 400 years ago in the carbon dating to demonstrate, when actual, organic matter stopped being deposited and you had these other sediments on top. Lots of big geologic words coming up, big warning. The gravel layer is composed of what's called subangular gravel. And that means it's not rounded, it's not, sharp, it's somewhere in between. It's been sort of lightly tossed through the floodplain from what's called periglacial action. And that is the action of freeze and thaw processes. And don't think, giant sheets of ice moving through, because this area was not glaciated. But that refers to freeze and thaw processes where you had these landslides and breaking down of bedrocks, and it left the hardest material, which was quartz gravel, to remain and rounded it slightly. And we do not see organic matter below that gravel. That gets into the earlier time periods where, you're going to find various megafauna and mastodon skulls and, below that, dinosaurs before that. So we like to go back to that wetland layer that occurred prior to European colonization. And the basic approach of that is you have this incised system, and you put in, you take out the overburden of the existing ground surface, and you restore it back down on the hydric soil. And the reason why this is so important is because when you get down to this hydric soil, you have this beautiful carbon sink. You have this beautiful gravel that has many, many size fractions in it. Okay, so you have gravel all the way up from fine sand. And in the case of the Eccleston site, we have material that looks like play sand. It is that clean. It's broken up sandstone that's on the site. There's also Cockeysville marble, the same stuff that makes up the steps in the row home in Baltimore City and the quarry that's behind the Hunt Valley Mall there. Same stuff is there. And there's about 3 or maybe even 4 geologies that intersect in this valley. And in that gravel layer is the most beautiful cold groundwater that you've ever seen in your life. When you dig a trench into it to investigate it, that trench, with a 3-foot wide backhoe bucket or excavator bucket, that trench will fill with water within minutes. There's that much groundwater there that is prevented from flowing into the stream by all the overburden on it and the fact that doesn't have a surface to express. So when we looked at this Eccleston site, we saw the thermal issues with it, where you had this large temperature range during the day. When we saw the substrates were not suitable for spawning, we knew what we had to do was to expose those fractions of gravel that would be suitable for spawning, and to expose that hydric soil and groundwater table so it could interact with the stream. This is an animation that shows what the old channel would have looked like when it flooded. And this is what the new channel looks like when it floods. You can see you go from a depth of water in red to a spread out floodplain that looks like, a bathtub basically when you're done grading it. So this does a lot of different things. It eliminates point source types of sediments. So if you have high banks that are contributing sediment to your watershed, which can of course smother your aquatic life, it removes that. It reestablishes wetland roots in the groundwater table. It creates and enhances wetlands. It increases recharge of the water table and exchange, which is called hypereic connection. Hypereic connection is the exchange of groundwater and surface waters. It repurposes all the resources on the site. So none of these trees that we take down as part of this leave, they all become lunker logs and digger logs and floodplain debris, which is really important for, salamanders and frogs and toads and all different things that live here. It buffers the thermal capacity of the stream. When you're exchanging this groundwater, even if it heats up in the sun a bit, you can actually cool it back down through exchange. We have 10,000 years of proof that shows it sequesters carbon. It restores the diversity of substrate in the channel itself for those smaller gravels that are so important for the whole food web of aquatic life, including fish that might use certain size substrates to build nests, including benthic macroinvertebrates, bugs, caddisflies, for example, that need smaller grit and sticks to make their homes. It has all kinds of properties and stability, nutrient reductions, and aesthetic values when you do this type of restoration work, coupled with in-channel habitat, I will say. If you don't do this with in-channel habitat, it takes a long time for that habitat to come back. So you do this combined with in-channel habitat structures, and you can get a lot of value out of it. So, what do we try to restore back to? When you look at the Eccleston site, we knew it was ditched and drained and tiled, but there was probably, historically, this was a brook trout fishery, most likely. And there were probably a lot of small, cold, spring-fed channels all through the site. I'm talking about little teeny channels, maybe only this wide, a foot or two wide, that would have been suitable for small fish, young fish, things of that nature, and connected that groundwater table with the main stem. You would have had a lot of wetlands in the valley bottom, and you would have had sporadic trees and shrubs. You would have probably had a lot of beaver interaction out there as part of that. So, we don't find a lot of trees and shrubs in that wetland layer that are preserved. We find bits and pieces, we find seeds, and we know that beaver like to mow down things and create dams and that nature. We occasionally find buried lodges. So we know that was going on out there. Given that, we have a lot of historical information about it being a brook trout fishery in this region, and that there's also a lot of old tax information about taxing beaver pelts. We know the two lived together and probably in the same places. And overall, I think these systems that, of course, I would have loved to have seen, but I was 11,000 years too late. They were low energy, vegetated, and they didn't move a lot of gravel in them. You would have had water come in a flood, or perhaps a seasonal discharge, a seasonal high water discharge, and you would have moved maybe small gravel, but not the larger pieces, versus the stream channel that was out there now, which it'll move, a watermelon sized piece of rock, if you let it. It has that much energy when it floods. And this is just another profile view here of that historic legacy sediment, the alluvium that came off farm fields and things during colonization and after, into the present day. What we call a Holocene wet meadow filled with sedges and rushes and lots of organic matter, and then this basal gravel layer in the Pleistocene back here. Not quite when dinosaurs ruled the earth, but when mastodons and woolly mammoths and things like that roamed Maryland. So quite some time ago. And we don't go that far back, but that's where the good gravel is. So there's a bunch of different ways to restore a stream. You could have lifted this channel up to connect it with the ground surface, but you would miss all this organic matter in this buried wetland layer, and you'd miss all the really awesome gravel that everything needs. So we weigh that decision carefully when we do stream work on a site. When you have, carved through that sediment, from those historic mill dams, it carves through and disconnects itself from its floodplain that's created, and then it incisors and erodes. And this is just a brief schematic of what that process looks like. We see this all through Maryland. It's part of the reason why most of our waterways, and particularly Baltimore County, are impaired for sediment. We see that very frequently. So if you leave the system alone and don't restore it, the new system has functions and values less than the original system that was impacted in colonization. We know that just based on the diversity of things that live in it. And it's less resilient to change. So if you have a large flow event, your stream will change very drastically, whereas when we look in the historic record, we know that for approximately 10.5 to 11,000 years, you had a system that basically remained depositional and was a meadow and a wetland. The best you can hope without going all the way back is to have what we call a non-source transport reach for most of the flow regime, which means the gravel that's in that stream it's going to transmit through it whatever is delivered to it. So that's what we call a non-source transport reach. That's one way to restore a stream. And a lot of times people do that by armoring the banks, which does a lot to impact habitat and is unsightly and has other issues. So we definitely did not want to do that at this site. When you have no area for floodwater to deposit on a floodplain, those nutrients and sediments that get delivered to a reach just get flushed down to the Chesapeake Bay. So that's obviously suboptimal. So we use a methodology that Fish and Wildlife Service uses called the stream functions pyramid, where biology is the top function. If your stream is not alive, what are you even doing this for? That's what I tell people, you know. So trout presence, even though brown trout are not native, you know, the brook trout is our native fish here. Brown trout are a great indicator species and fulfill that niche. And we can always look towards, you know, the future when maybe, you know, we restore enough that we can reestablish brook trout. Below that, we look at the physiochemical properties of a stream. Those have a lot to do with the things that are alive there. Geomorphology, the actual shape and dimension and transport qualities of a stream, transporting gravel and woody debris and leaf matter. We look at the hydraulic properties of a stream, how water is conveyed, how fast, how much stress it puts out on banks and other objects. And then we look at the hydrology, the actual physical water and quantity of water itself. And we look at all those parameters. And when we looked at the Eccleston site, we realized that embracing that native geology and those types of systems were going to do more for a trout population than any type of Band-Aid approach. And that was coupled too because we had an instance here where in some cases, if you have an established forest, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to tear it down to start from scratch. Here we had a forest dominated by green ash, and a lot of the other native species of trees were choked by English ivy. So here we realized that there was some compromises that could be made. We could do some clearing and reestablish this. And, you know, since trout weren't spawning there and the benthos was poor, we really had only from the ground up to go up. So when we do this approach, we're going for that substrate. And on the left side of the screen there, you can see the native substrate that we uncovered at Eccleston. It is a beautiful mixture of multicolored clean gravel in multiple size fractions. And I don't know how far you guys go into you know, fishery biology or things like that, but you know, those of you who avidly fish or go into the deep woods, you know, of the West or different places, know that when you see good clean gravel like this, you're in for something special in terms of the fishery. Our hydric soil is already a wetland. It just needs to be uncovered and have plants growing on it. We call that 2-parameter positive. To have a wetland, you need hydrology, the water, you need soil, that is a wetland soil, that color, it has certain chemical properties. And then you need plants that only live in wetlands to grow on it. So when you do this, you're already 2/3 of the way there. And another reason to do this is, you know, almost every instance, you're going to reduce all those engineering parameters that people see as beneficial. You're going to reduce the shear stress, the force of the water, the velocity, and you lower the 100-year floodplain when you do this type of work. This is just one of the cute little renderings that my company does to demonstrate that and how the changes happen. The other thing that we know about this is this approach is resilient with climate. And no matter, you know, what side of the spectrum you're on, you know, the climate changes. We don't necessarily know all the reasons why. We have lots of historic record about that climate. And we have 11 years of documentation with that hydric soil layer that you were having a fairly stable system that functioned much the same way through that whole period. So we know this is a resilient practice moving forward. So that begs the question what it looks like. And this is what you guys have been waiting for, and I apologize for all the background. This is a fresh piece of stream that we just reconnected in the Jones Falls. And you guys saw the previous pictures with the high banks. This is brand new stream reconstructed at the Jones Falls. I took this picture on, I believe it was Monday morning. You have very low banks. You can see the darkness of the soil. That's that hydric soil. And then we leave the debris out there. That debris can be moved and tossed around and whatever you want. There's these stakes here holding this matting. This is a biodegradable coconut fiber matting. They make us use that for erosion and sediment control. So, you know, that's something we have to install to help keep that sediment in place while it vegetates. When it does vegetate, we often find that some of the seeds that were in it that have been buried for 10,000 years are still viable, which is incredible to me. And, you know, we add a lot of in-channel habitat. We flew drone photography on the site. This was back, I want to say we did this in, hold on, let me think. I think this was January or February. This is a huge site. There's 100 acres of work. There's pieces where we save existing forest where it makes sense. There's other places where we utilize it in the stream. This is nothing to sneeze at, folks. There's haul roads that go around. There's multiple excavators, haul trucks, you name it. There's 4 or 5 guys working on this at any period of time. There's all kinds of erosion sediment control practices. Hold on, I'll show you guys here in a second. This is what's called a clean water diversion. Clean water comes in off the site. We convey it stably through. There's super silt fence. There's haul roads and temporary access bridges, silt sock, you name it. We do it on the site. We have a really conscientious contractor. It's SMC. They're up in Parkton and also have an office in Hunt Valley. Scott Maycomber, I don't know if you folks know him, but he's doing a great job for us. They have a lot of specialized people doing that work and helping us with that. It takes a really patient operator to do that. This is just another shot of the site. Again, a really large site. We're converting all the ag land basically into forest with the exception of the parcel directly adjacent to Park Heights and Green Spring Valley Road. And that gets turned into warm season grassland. So we've retired this entire 100 acres out of agriculture, and we're adding in some places 400-foot forested buffers to this stream, which is pretty unprecedented. When I went to the Army Corps and told them that I was proposing a 400-foot buffer, they said, well, we've never credited a buffer over 200 feet. And I said, well, better figure out how to do this one. We're going to do a 400-foot buffer on it and totally reforest it. As part of this project, I think I briefly mentioned before, it goes into a perpetual conservation easement. That easement is going to be held by North American Land Trust. They're a conservation organization and a nonprofit. To go along with that, there is a very substantial monitoring, maintenance, adaptive management, and stewardship fund to handle anything that comes up in the future, including legal defense. Let's say somebody wants to put a pipeline through here, you know, you need to pay lawyers to tell them to buzz off, you know. Maybe it's maintaining trees. Maybe it's doing future monitoring. All those things are put together in a stewardship fund. And, you know, that's a real difference from a lot of the stream work that you see where people might go in and do some work, but then they walk away and nobody ever comes back. That's pretty much what I have for you guys tonight. I did have a few other photos if you really wanted, but I feel like I've been talking for a long time and I may have been on mute. You know, maybe nobody heard anything. Does anybody have any questions about what we're doing out there?
Jim, this is Tom. I do have a question.
Sure, Tom.
Okay, now I just heard you recently towards the end said it was what, 100 acres? I thought it was like 57. So what are we talking about there?
So the entire parcel is 99 point something acres.
Okay.
There used to be 73 in agriculture. So that leaves, quick math, 26 that were either too wet to farm or wooded. When we're done, more than, hold on, don't hold me to this. I believe it's more than 50 will be forested. So there's a net gain in forest. And then the other remaining ag lands will go into warm season grassland. So that's big blue stem, little blue stem, things of that nature. And And eventually those will probably secede towards forest. But long story short, they won't be sprayed or maintained as agriculture again. So we won't, even in the areas where we don't remove the drain tile. That's my daughter. She's saying hi.
Hi.
She likes
Thanks.
fish too. Don't worry. Okay. Okay, sweetie. Thanks.
Okay, so that being said, let's see, first of all, I'm not in the business of stream restoration. In other words, I don't have that background. But what I have noticed is that the majority of people, except maybe the people right there in that valley, do not know that this has taken place. And, it's just a fantastic thing, in my opinion. Is there a reason why you guys didn't put a sign up out there?
So we thought it was more coordinate with the stakeholders who cared first. So that's Trout Unlimited, and we've been working with Brian. That is Maryland DNR. That's the Valley's Planning Council. We had Renee out there from VPC, and we've actually been coordinating with VPC since before Renee was even there, to let people know that this was happening. The thing that's important to note is it's not a, although MDTA is the ultimate permittee, it's not a public project. It's not on public land. So we weren't hiding anything from anyone, but we were talking with the stakeholders who really cared first. We've talked with the neighbors. I cannot express to you how warm and receptive everyone has been to this project. Skeptical, yes. A lot of people, had a lot of questions, and that's natural,
Yeah.
But it was really important with us to work with that community. We worked even, so there's theoretically an entire environmental justice component of this project because it does flow ultimately into Baltimore City. So we even talked with Blue Water Baltimore, Baltimore Neighbor Space. I know I'm missing people because I've been put on the spot, but we've tried to really engage as many stakeholders as possible. Plus the project went out on public notice. That's the agency way of getting the public involved. We didn't get a lot of public comments on it, quite honestly. But other than that, yeah, I mean, anyone who was interested, we tried to engage with and get their ideas and try to walk them through the same process that we were going through.
Okay, well, I'm just totally impressed with it. And I noticed that there is a lot of education that you put in this preparation, this presentation. I'm wondering, would you consider maybe having, like, in the fall, a one-day seminar where the schools can bring the students in at some place? Now, of course, this is the pandemic, so we don't know how that's going to pan out. But
right.
I've been in a lot of the schools, with doing the Trout in the classroom,
Mm-hmm.
and restoration and, the ecosystem and all that is real high on their lists for the people, that I deal with. And you just unbelievably put out a lot of information.
There will be a quiz, just to let you guys know, there will be a quiz. And actually, I probably could, if any of you guys need continuing education credits, I could probably certify that for you. But no, there's definitely an opportunity for that, and we're excited for it. It has to go through the landowner, of course. Right now, we're a little bit hesitant to take large groups on the site and do any, and especially children, because of the active construction zone. And that has everybody a little bit on edge because construction accidents do happen. But in the future, no, definitely, there's an opportunity for that, because even Blue Water Baltimore has expressed, listen, I don't need to tell you guys, you're Trout Unlimited, but getting people who wouldn't be ordinarily near a natural resource immersed in a natural resource it changes a person and for the better. And I think that's something that, that I'm happy people always took that time with me, and I'm happy to take that time with other people so they get that experience. So yeah, absolutely. I see that opportunity in the future.
Yeah, Jim, I wasn't thinking about necessarily bringing them out to the site. I was thinking about, getting a large room at one of the nature centers or one of the schools, and letting you do your presentation for the school kids.
I'm no stranger to that. My mother was a Baltimore City school teacher for 30 years at Martin Luther King Elementary School. So I love talking to kids about water. So absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else have any questions?
Okay,
Yeah.
I guess one more.
Yeah,
Bill's got one.
yeah. Actually, first off, thank you so much for the amount of detail you put into this, because I think this was absolutely fascinating presentation from beginning to end. And I know that this is years of work. And first off, there's a couple of other things in there. First, the investigative aspects of this was incredible. How much you're able to uncover. And I don't know how you could find all this stuff. I mean, first off, you're out in the field seeing it firsthand, but also to the historical records and the aerials from way back were most impressive. It's incredible what the land's been through. And secondly, you need to turn this into a TV show somehow, because I'm telling you, this is very, very high quality
Oh,
material here.
good idea.
And you could do a lot with this, and and Tom suggested something, but this is pretty significant work, and it is under the radar. And I can't tell you how impressed I am with your work and the results here. So again, fantastic. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I really appreciate that. So one thing, we work as a team. A really important thing to me is you get the experts you need to figure out, what's the right thing to do. I don't have all the answers, but by golly, I know people who might. And so engaging with those people, crossing those borders and doing that is really important to me. And the other thing is this site, I have to say, I think it is unprecedented in the state of Maryland for how much data and background collection we actually collected. And it was necessary to demonstrate the purpose and need. Bill, did you have a question? I think I saw you.
Yeah, I did. First, thank you very much for the presentation. And secondly, you might have said, but what federal agency oversaw the NEPA process?
So that is an interesting question. I am not a NEPA expert, though I have lots of history doing NEPA. Ultimately, that would come down to the Army Corps, I would say, because the Army Corps wrote a record of decision. The permit for this is wrapped into it gets more complicated than that, though. And I'm assuming you're asking about NEPA because you know something about it. My understanding is the NEPA for this is wrapped into the permit for the highway impact. So when I modify my permit out here, I actually modify the highway permit, which is complicated. A lot of people look at that. So we have to make sure we're dotting all our I's and crossing all our T's. That's my understanding of who's leading the NEPA. The Army Corps ultimately co-chairs the IRT with Maryland Department of the Environment. And the Army Corps, I believe, writes the record of decision, at least they have in the previous one. So they would be the ultimate lead agency in that regard, I think.
Yeah, that sounds right. Thank you.
Hi, Jim. This is Russ. Excellent presentation. One of the things that was most surprising to me, echoing Mark's comments, were the amount of research you guys did about what the land has been through up to this point. For context, we've had Theo Pike speak before, and he is from England, and he does a lot of work about trout, what he calls trout in dirty places, but basically like urban trout,
Yes.
trout that live in these streams that have just been.
I love that name. That's great.
Yeah, treated like this for, in their case, they're very cognizant of the fact that humans have impacted these places for almost 2,000 years, really, since the Romans. Here in Maryland, it's incredible to me how many records they have on what was done for the last couple of hundred years. To put it in context, what really shocked me about this was that I'm originally from Florida and grew up fishing and being in the water there. When it comes to human activity, modern human activity, there really wasn't a lot down there, and certainly not a lot recorded. So when I hear about, you guys know about these different, with the clay tiles and the clay pipes 250 years ago, that's crazy to me, and I go out to a stream now and I see the stream as it is. And I think a lot of people probably have this experience where they go for a hike out there by the Jones Falls and they think this is nature. This is the natural state of things right
Right.
here as we see it. And the truth is it's a stream that's been completely reshaped by human activity. Doesn't look anything like what you guys are restoring it to, which is actually its natural state. So I guess what I'm getting to is to the extent that you do get any pushback or difficult comments to deal with, do you think just being able to educate people on what a natural stream actually looks like? Those last couple of slides you showed us on what the goal of the restoration is with the floodplain. I think a lot of people probably don't have in their head that that is actually what a stream could look like. And even if you can educate the property owners in that area that you're dealing with, when it comes to the general public who use a lot of these trails around Jones Falls and Gunpowder and all these streams, I'm not sure when they see this kind of thing and they see guys clearing trees and creating these floodplains, I'm not sure they really understand that like that's the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and that's a really great point. And I think the best example of that is one of the spokesmen for the landowners. His name is Howard Bacher, and he's a professor at Towson University. He's a smart guy, okay, real smart guy. And his biggest complaint to me is that, Jim, you've told me what streams actually need to look like, and now everything looks impaired to me wherever I go. And before he was just sort of oblivious to it. And now he's like, oh, well, I don't have the connectivity, oh, I see a drain tile over here. Oh, this looks like it's been ditched. So if I have ruined your appreciation for places you've been, I'm sorry. But it is, and it takes a lot to articulate that to people. And like, for example, we had to explain to the landowners here what the agriculture was actually doing to the system. They looked at this and had a tenant farmer, and they saw idyllic corn and not the veritable hazardous waste site draining into a trout stream. And before they wanted to limit, we were only going to have 50-foot buffers. And it took 4 years, and it took us actually renting the land and putting it in rye and showing the difference in the quality. Yeah, so JMT farmed 73 acres of rye for a couple years. That was cool. Nothing that I'm a stranger to, but my corporate people, they didn't have the overalls and the straw hats, to go along. But showing them that and the difference and having the time to do that, and time is money when you have a project like this, having the budget to facilitate that was really vital. To explain that to them. And now I don't have a bigger advocate than the landowners. They love the project. Howie is always excited. He's like, Jim, when are the beaver going to come in? I'm like, I don't know, Howie. There's none nearby. We'll find out if they come in or not. So yeah, just educating people to that potential, to what the existing condition is, and that what might be pristine in one person's eyes may have a lot of history that's beneath the surface. I think that's really critical as part of watershed education.
That's great. And I just to add, I think Tom had some great ideas of one, if we can do some youth outreach on this specific topic, I think that's great because they get the education early in life and hopefully take it home to their parents as well. But then also some signage out there on these projects so that, some signage that represents here's what a stream naturally should look like. Here's what it would have looked like before the agriculture of the 17 or 1800s. Just so people understand, because again, people we're so used to it at this point. We're so used to bluff banks and those kind of things that
right.
It's almost hard to imagine that that's not the way it's supposed to be.
So I think, I touched on this before, one of the most important things for people to realize is this stream is designed so that the seasonal high groundwater table is the flood stage. And think about that, like that's very common in Western streams where there's snowpack on mountains and things like that. This is the secret hidden hydrograph of Eastern streams. We have this seasonal high groundwater table. And like right now, when you come out to the Eccleston site, after we put the water back into it, when we move the pump around, it's flooding, which is kind of hard to wrap your head around. And when you get to June and July, it'll go back down. but think of the different temporal availability of habitats and the different micro channel habitats you get when you design a stream that way, so that when you do get a large storm that comes through, it's a brief event, it holds lots of water, it recharges the groundwater. It doesn't just pass it and all the gravel and all the mud right through. And that's the whole scale change that we've affected on the site. And that's why it's not just a channel restoration, it's a channel, a floodplain, and a watershed that we're restoring as well. And that's a lot of signs to put on a site, but by golly, we'll try.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think in the fly fishing world, people know there's a huge difference between Western streams and Eastern streams, and a lot of it has to do with what we've covered here tonight.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that it gets even more detailed. I went to Iceland. It was part of a great vacation. It was the honeymoon that took a while to get to, and I married my wife, and we went about 10 years after. And there's some great brown trout fisheries there. And what's amazing about them is they're all above the tree line. There's not a tree to be seen, and it's all through flow diversity and quality of substrate and temperature of the water that you attain that type of fishery. Here we have a lot more to work with. We have trees and woody debris, and then the substrate, and then a different seasonal groundwater table. So those fisheries really change all over the world, and to build one of these and not be cognizant of what those other fisheries are like and consider it is, that's really the path forward that we felt worked here.
So Jim, this is,
All right, I'll go for it. So Jim, thank you very much. That was a really great presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impact that this restoration would have on some of the sites downstream. So obviously there's a lot of really, really great things going on at the Eccleston site. But what are some of the implications as you get, just downstream, a mile downstream, 2 miles on, water temperature, flooding, all of that?
So ideally with time, so it's important, the saying I like to use, and I'm pretty sure I stole this from John Stewart, is you have to mash some chickpeas if you're going to make hummus. In the first years after restoring this, before vegetation starts to fully establish, you are going to probably see slightly increased thermal temperatures, but probably not the range of temperatures that we saw when it was so disconnected to the groundwater. One immediate effect that you'll see is we can just store a lot more water in the site than before. So you're going to be releasing that water more slowly downstream. So when you have a hydrograph from a storm that looks like a peak and a tailing discharge, downstream it's going to come up and probably be a longer, straighter hydrograph as that water is released. So that should put less stress on the banks. I mean, ultimately you should be delivering less sediment downstream, fine-grained sediments. But downstream is really complicated. The first farm down there is the former Bacher farm that was before they subdivided it off. There's not a lot of trees there. There's a dam. There's some areas that have been rip-wrapped. So some of those things won't be prevalent. What we ultimately hope here is to have more spawnable habitat and increase the number of trout and try to push towards the, what was observed in the 1980s or hopefully better. Those are things that would have more watershed impact, I would think, having greater abundance, reducing sediment, flattening the hydrograph. Those are the things, but these are things that are measured in very long time scales. So it's important to keep that in context that, I have 10 years of monitoring out here before a long-term steward takes over. 10 years is really just the beginning, and 50 years is what I'd love to be able to see. And I don't know if I'll be there to see it. You never know. They might have to freeze me, and then thaw me back out.
Awesome, thank you.
Jim, I'd like to share something with you if I could. I want to show you downstream temperature. So I gotta wait. Can you unshare your screen,
Yep.
please?
Yep, let me find it here. Pause share. Stop share.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay.
Let's see. Now let me figure out how to share. Where's it at? Why doesn't it tell me what I want to share? Here we go. Can you see that now? Let me try it again. Maybe that didn't do it.
No, it's there. It's there. We're looking at
Okay.
the spreadsheet.
I think I have too many windows up. Oh, wait, that is your spreadsheet. Okay, good.
Yes.
I thought it was one of mine, one of the three I have up on my screen right now.
So back in, let's see, what was that? September last year, I went out, it was roughly midday. The air temperature, and that was shade temperature, by the way, was 87. And I started at each of the locations, starting up at the golf course, on the golf course side, measured the water temperature and took it down at each of the bridges.
Yep.
So while my gauge may not be calibrated, might have been a cheap temperature gauge, it was the same gauge on through.
Mhm.
And I allowed enough time for it to stabilize. So you can see from the section that you're talking about, it started out at 58.6 and it
Awesome.
actually was 62.7 at the bridge at Park Heights Avenue.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we did see that in our temperature data. It was interesting. I didn't bring up temperature data because there's only so many numbers we can look at a night.
Right.
All 5 gauges will equalize when you get a flow event. So you'll watch all the gauges turn into one line when you track them all together. Overall, when you look top to bottom, we would see between 3 and 5 degrees of gain on average through the site. What was really interesting is things usually held, and I'm paraphrasing a lot of data here. Usually you were pretty good into the morning. Where it got really interesting is you got further into the night. So after the sun would go down, you would even still see some temperature rise still, telling me that there was something warm that this water was flowing over, that it was still pulling energy off of. And like I said, we did 3 years of 15-minute data, and that just told us a lot of different things. I want to emphasize, by no means am I saying that this stream is thermally unsuitable for trout. We measure, the other thing that's really important too is we measured riffle temperatures. So adult foraging trout habitat is what we looked at. Pools stay cool on the site because they're deep and they're, they have more surface area. When you look at riffle temperature, the water is shallower. It's also faster moving. You potentially have more thermal gain because it's shallower.
Okay.
But we wanted to look at foraging habitats, and all of those temperatures are riffle temperatures. And that's where you saw this. And then if you got into the pool, you got more mixing and you would see a slower gain with those. So we did instantaneous checks of the pools to look at the difference. And then what you would find is that riffle temperature in that range, depending on the conditions, you might start at 60 degrees, but you might end on a tributary. It was not uncommon to have 85-degree water at certain parts of the day. And those were ones that we looked, and they really didn't have trout in them. Some of those tributaries coming in. There's also, on one of the tributaries, there's 2 ponds. If you go up Burnside Farm Road off there, there's one pond you can see, and then there's another one up in the woods. If you know those people, I would love to do a grant or something to remove those ponds, because you would also get quite a bit of thermal gain because those are inline ponds. So the stream comes into the pond, mixes in the pond itself, and then comes out. So you have that thermal reservoir that you were seeing through the day. Now, granted, that will then mix when it hits the main stem. It would mix, for example, the thermal characteristics change in the diversion pipe. The diversion pipe was actually keeping the water cold in part of the Jones Falls where it was warm in the main stem. So again, this site, like an onion, has many layers to it, and it just took a lot of time to figure it all out. And I still haven't figured it all out. I'm sure I still haven't.
Well, again, I want to thank you for your excellent, presentation and all the data you collected and all the research. It was just impressive, very impressive.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks again for you guys' support. We really appreciate it.
Okay. Are there any other questions or before we end the thing tonight?
There was one in the chat about follow-ups on trout monitoring and how long you guys were
Oh,
gonna do
yeah.
that, if at all?
Yeah, so we're gonna do 10 years of monitoring data. That includes benthic macroinvertebrates, fisheries assessment, wetlands, forests, temperature, pretty much a mirror of everything we did in the baseline to actually determine the impact. And that's already funded. You know, it's a 13-year contract. And by the end of this, I'll have worked on this piece of the Jones Falls for pushing 20 years. So if you guys are looking for me in the future, just hang out the site and I'll show up there eventually.
Okay, Jim, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your
Have a
time.
nice one.
Take care.
Much. Fantastic.
Bye.